Revelations on RAS TAFARI. The RAS TAFARI movement began, unfortunately, with a number of mistakes. The name chosen for the movement, the person chosen as a black man's god, the lineage of this individual is bogus, and his names and titles were and are grossly misunderstood. The first blunder, then, the movement's name, the RAS TAFARI movement. On the 2nd of November 1930, His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie I was crowned as Emperor of Ethiopia, even though he was on the throne from the 3rd of April that same year, following the death of Empress Zauditu on April 2, 1930. A movement which began in the 1930s and which was designed to revere him as God by using his name could not properly use RAS TAFARI as the name of the movement, because Haile Selassie ceased being a RAS, or head of an army, as far back as 1928, becoming a Negus or king in 1928, and was titled Negusa Nagast, King of the Kings of Ethiopia, from 1930 until his death on the 27th of August 1975. We shall return to the names and titles issue later. The second mistake is that the early Rastas, while being literally fussy about blackness as Negroes, ended up worshipping a non-Negro as their god. Haile Selassie, by his own claim and looks, and based on that all-important national saga and cycle of legends, the Kebra Nagast, springs from a Semitic non-black dynasty. As the anti-Negro or pro-Semitic Kebra Nagast says, quote, "For by the will of God, every kingdom of the world was given to the seed of Shem, Semites, and slavery to the seed of Ham, Hamites," unquote. This statement in the Kebra Nagast was designed to show that only Semitic rulers were legitimate occupants of the throne in Ethiopia. This means, as the Jamaican cleric the Reverend C.S. Reed said in 1975, quote, that in racial terms, His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie has more in common with the Jews or Arabs than with Negroes, unquote. The Haile Selassie mistake is compounded in the mistaken belief that he had links with King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. This belief is central to the Kebra Nagast and is reflected in the 1955 Ethiopian constitution that Haile Selassie devised. Article 2 says, quote, "The imperial dignity shall remain perpetually attached to the line of Haile Selassie I, descendant of King Haile Selassie, whose line descends without interruption from the dynasty of Menelik I, son of the Queen of Ethiopia, the Queen of Sheba, and King Solomon of Jerusalem," unquote. This claim has been picked up uncritically by Rastas, but is it factual? There is no reputable literary proof of a sexual liaison between Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, resulting in the birth of the first emperor of Ethiopia, Menelik I, or Ebna Hakim, son of the wise, in Hebrew, Christian, or Arabic sources that treat with the Solomon Queen of Sheba story. The Bible, though fairly explicit about Solomon's sexual misdeeds, says nothing about a sexual union between him and the Queen of Sheba, though some scholars have tried to read sex into the statement in 1 Kings 10 and verse 2, which says the queen, quote, "came to Solomon," unquote. It is true that the Hebrew word bo, translated as came in the text, can mean a sexual encounter, as it does in Genesis 16:2, but it is context that determines the nuance that a word has, and in this context, a non-sexual come is meant. Notice that the reason for her coming to Solomon is stated in verse 2, quote, "to test him with hard questions," unquote, and in verse 3, the queen also, quote, "came to Jerusalem," unquote. Most importantly, in standard Jewish prose, it would be most unlikely to find a mere woman in Jewish reckoning initiating sexual intercourse with a king of Israel. If sex was meant in 1 Kings 10:2, the reading would be, quote, "when the king had come to her," unquote. Some have also tried to read sex into 1 Kings 10:13, where the text says, quote, "King Solomon gave the Queen of Sheba all she desired," unquote, presumably a child. But this conclusion does violence to the verse which continues, quote, "whatever she asked, besides what Solomon had given her, according to the royal bounty," unquote. Josephus, in his Antiquities, basically reiterates the Old Testament narrative. The Talmud and the early and late Midrashim have no mention of sex or offspring. Targum Shani, the second Targum or Aramaic translation to Esther 1:2, which is the most complete rabbinical account of the story concerning Solomon and the queen, contains no reference to marriage or sexual intercourse. The first document to mention sex between the two monarchs is a spurious Jewish work called the Alphabet of Ben Sira, in which the child resulting from the union is Nebuchadnezzar. The Quran, in Surah 27, 15-45, contains most of the elements found in Targum Shani, and, like it, makes no mention of sex or offspring. Some Muslim commentaries relate traditions suggesting a marriage between the monarchs with no mention of a child. Other commentaries speak of a child called Ibn Hakim, child of the wise, but these seem to be based on Ethiopian sources. In the Kebra Nagast, we find the claim that Menelik I or Ibn Hakim, with King Solomon's assistance, stole the Jewish Ark of the Covenant and took it to Ethiopia. Listen to the verdict of two leading scholars. C. Conti Rossini, noted specialist on Ethiopia of an earlier period, said, quote, "Of the journey of Ibn Hakim or Menelik I, there is no historical record. The individual is fictitious, the journey is fictitious." This is found in Rossini's book, Storia de Ethiopia, page 253. D. A. Hubbard's doctoral dissertation was on the literary sources of the Kebra Nagast, and he says concerning the abduction of the Ark, quote, "There exists no parallel account of this event in either rabbinical or Islamic literature, although the story occurs in various forms on Ethiopian soil," unquote. This is found at page 332. It should be noted that even if you bypass the historical problems with Menelik I, there is no historical support for the Rastafari claim that Haile Selassie was in an unbroken bloodline of Ethiopian rulers going back to King Solomon. The problem is that just prior to the reign of Yekuna Amlak, approximately AD 1270 to 1285, there was a line of Negroes, the Zagwe dynasty, on the throne of Ethiopia for at least 150 years, and they were totally unrelated ethnically and dynastically to the so-called Solomonic dynasty from which Selassie allegedly springs. Further, rulership in Ethiopia was not by father-son descent, but by power. Despite claims of a Solomonic dynasty, only one emperor in the last 200 years of the monarchy, Lij Yasu, actually succeeded by father-son descent. Emperors Tewodros 1855 to 1868, Johannes IV 1872 to 1889, Menelik II 1889 to 1913, and Haile Selassie 1930 to 1975 reached the throne only after they emerged the most powerful men in the country. Further, there was no unbroken monarchy in Ethiopia. In 1753, the monarchy collapsed and the era of the princes was ushered in. The monarchy was restored in 1855 when Theodore came to power. Emperor Haile Selassie's Christian profession is or should be something of an embarrassment to the Rastafari movement. In 1966, His Imperial Majesty opened the World Congress on Evangelism in Berlin, where he said, quote, "The love shown in Christ by our God to mankind should constrain all of us who are followers and disciples of Christ to do all in our power to see to it that the message of salvation is carried to those of our fellows for whom Christ our Savior was sacrificed, but who have not had the benefit of hearing the good news. Christians, let us arise and labor to lead our brothers and sisters to our Savior Jesus Christ, who only can give life in its fullest sense," unquote. Consistent with this plea, after witnessing the response by Rastas to his visit to Jamaica in the same year, 1966, His Imperial Majesty mandated one of his priests, Laike Maria Mandefro, in 1970, later to become Abuna Yesak, to start a branch of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church in Jamaica for the benefit of Rastas and others. According to the Abun, the emperor said, quote, "I want you to help these people. My heart is broken because of the situation of these people. Help them to find the true God. Teach them," unquote. In the same interview, Abuna Yesak said, quote, "When I am asked, is the emperor God? I say the emperor is a devout Christian," unquote. We return now to the issue of the names and titles of Haile Selassie. The name Haile Selassie, which means power of the Trinity, was the Christian baptismal name given to the infant Tafari Makonnen, son of Ras Makonnen. As the son of a nobleman, he was Lige Tafari Makonnen from 1892 to 1905. He became a general in 1905 and so became Dejazmach, or a general, until 1916, when his military title changed to Ras, head of an army. He was Ras Tafari Makonnen until 1928. From 1928 to 1930, he held the court rank of Negus or king, and at his coronation, he earned the supreme court rank Negusa Nagast, king of the kings of Ethiopia, and opted for his baptismal name as his throne name. We know this from the biography of His Imperial Majesty, written by his personal friend Christine Sanford, and titled The Lion of Judah Hath Prevailed. She writes of the emperor, quote, "He took the throne name of Haile Selassie I. This was his baptismal name, which every child receives from the priest at baptism, and which they may or may not use for general purposes." Unquote. This is at page 56. It may be a source of shock to some Rastas to learn that Haile Selassie was not the only one called by that name. Sanford also says, quote, "Meanwhile, in the house, Lige Tafari would be under the care of his guardian, Fitorari Kolak. His companions during these years were his cousin Imeru Haile Selassie, later to become Ras, and Tafari Belau." Unquote. This is found at page 28. When Rastas greet in the name of His Imperial Majesty, they refer to him among other things as Lord of Lords, Conquering Lion of the Tribe of Judah. These two presumed titles are also the result of mistakes. Lord of Lords was never ever in Ethiopian history used as a title of any emperor. It is directly taken from Revelation 19:16, which also has King of Kings. Now it needs to be known that in Ethiopia, the enduring titles of emperors going back to the 18th century at least were Elect of God, meaning the one chosen by God to lead the country, and King of the Kings of Ethiopia, often shortened to King of Kings. Ethiopia had regional rulers, including kings, each of whom would vie for supreme authority as emperor. The statement, "The Lion of the Tribe of Judah hath prevailed," which normally appears just before the imperial name and titles, and directly drawn from Revelation 5:5, was used by Ethiopian emperors on their seals and in their letters to show the Christian nature of the empire. The late 19th century Emperor Menelik II, because of mistaken translations from Amharic into European languages, had the motto of the empire used as part of his imperial title, so he was popularly called Conquering Lion of the Tribe of Judah, or for short, the Lion of Judah. This tradition prevailed through to Haile Selassie as well. During Haile Selassie's reign, the motto from Revelation 5:5 was used to open all imperial proclamations and decrees. But the opening words of the 1942 proclamation, establishing the Negarit Gazeta, reads, quote, "Conquering Lion of the Tribe of Judah, Haile Selassie I, Elect of God, Emperor of Ethiopia, we proclaim as follows," unquote. Commenting on the English text vis-a-vis the Ge'ez or Old Ethiopic text, Sven Rubenson, writing in the Journal of Ethiopian Studies, observes, quote, "There are two important discrepancies here. The Ge'ez motto from Revelation 5 is incorrectly translated. The statement has become an attribute, and as a consequence, the pronoun we, which in the Amharic sets the motto clearly apart from the names and titles of the emperor, has been moved after the titles, thereby permitting Conquering Lion of the Tribe of Judah to become part of the titles. That this can hardly have been done intentionally is indicated also by the full stop after Judah in the Amharic version. This is in volume 3, number 2, July 1965, at page 85. So then, Rastas who regard Haile Selassie as God because of his titles, King of Kings and Lord of Lords, are simply mistaken and have been led astray by ignorance of basic Ethiopian history. The imperial title, King of Kings in Ethiopia, was a shortened version of King of the Kings of Ethiopia, and should not be equated with the global King of Kings used of Jesus Christ in Revelation 19:16. Lord of Lords was never ever used as an imperial title in Ethiopia, and so is completely inappropriate and mistakenly used by Rastas with reference to Emperor Haile Selassie, no doubt because the expression appears in Revelation 19:16 along with King of Kings. What we have seen so far is that Haile Selassie had no name or title that was unique to him, and indeed, some of the titles he is said to have by Rastas are as a result of mistakes. Have you ever wondered why the repatriation movement has been so centered on Ethiopia, when most blacks in the Western world came from West Africa and not East Africa? For Rastas at least, part of the possible answer has to do with the mention of Ethiopia in the Bible and the fact that Haile Selassie was from Ethiopia. There is much clarification necessary, though, concerning the use of the word Ethiopia in the Bible and in ancient literature. There is very little that can be found in recorded history for the piece of real estate that we now call Ethiopia. There seems to be a clear reference to the ancestors of modern Ethiopians in the anonymous 1st or 2nd century AD account of trade in the Red Sea area called Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. Mention of Ethiopia or Ethiopians by classical writers such as Homer and Herodotus must not be confused with clear accounts of what we now call Ethiopia. This is so because the term Ethiopia was used to describe almost all of Africa and even beyond in ancient times. This is well known and admitted by serious scholars of whatever ethnicity or color. See Chancellor Williams, The Destruction of Black Civilization, page 105. Black Women in Antiquity, edited by Ivan van Sertima, page 12. Edward Uhlendorf, The Ethiopians, pages 1 to 12. Pillars in Ethiopian History, the work of William Leo Hansbury, edited by Joseph Harris, page 63. Mention of Ethiopia in the Bible suffers from the same geographical imprecision, and as John Markakis, former lecturer at the Haile Selassie I University in Addis Ababa, has correctly said, quote, "In the Septuagint or Greek version of the Old Testament, the Hebrew name Cush was translated into the Greek Ethiopia, giving rise to the claim of Ethiopia's existence in biblical times, the myth of a history that is 3,000 years old," unquote. Edward Uhlendorf argues similarly, quote, "In assessing the significance of biblical references to Ethiopia, one has to bear in mind that the Hebrew Cush, which has been rendered by the Septuagint as Ethiopia, lacks any precise connotation. It is clear that the biblical Cush is a vague term connoting the entire Nile Valley south of Egypt, including Nubia and Abyssinia," unquote. This is found at page 5 of Uhlendorf's book, Ethiopia and the Bible. It is worthy of note that Uhlendorf advances a distinction between Ethiopia and Abyssinia in his book, Semitic Languages of Ethiopia, at page 4. Since Uhlendorf and Markakis, to the best of my knowledge, are non-black, I double-check their assertions concerning what is in the Hebrew text of the Bible. In some 21 Old Testament references to Ethiopia in the Authorized Version, the Hebrew text has Cush every time. Careful readers familiar with the Hebrew will know that Psalm 68 and verse 31 in the English is verse 32 in the Hebrew. Of course, one could attempt to prove conclusively that modern Ethiopia is geographically the same as ancient Cush, but that would be quite an academic task. It might be helpful to point out that even the mention of an Ethiopian eunuch and a queen of the Ethiopians in Acts 8:27 has nothing to do with modern Ethiopia, despite what the Kebra Nagast says. Based on what is known about the area in which the hereditary title Candace was used, New Testament scholar I. Howard Marshall says, quote, "The man, the eunuch, came from the country now known as Sudan, rather than modern Ethiopia, where he was a eunuch employed in the court service of the Queen Mother, who was known by the hereditary title of Candace and was an effective ruler of the country," unquote. This is in his commentary, Marshall's commentary, on Acts, page 162. In the Kebra Nagast, not only are the eunuch and Candace seen as belonging to Ethiopia of the 1st century, but the Kebra Nagast regards Candace as the Queen of Sheba, despite the sizable time gap between the two, approximately 900 years. We have had occasion to mention the Kebra Nagast a few times so far, but you may be wondering what this document really is. Well, the Kebra Nagast is Amharic for glory of the kings and is described in the book The Church of Ethiopia as, quote, "This great cycle of legends and stories which is woven into the very fabric of Ethiopian life, unquote. D.A. Hubbard, in his doctoral dissertation, The Literary Sources of the Kebra Nagast, says, quote, probably there is no single indigenous document from which so much may be learned about the Ethiopian way of life and thought. In addition to being the chief source of the Solomon Sheba story, the Kebra Nagast also contains a large amount of material illustrating the monophysite beliefs and typological exegesis of the Abyssinian Church. It may well be said that the Kebra Nagast is outstanding evidence of the variegated Ethiopian civilization, for within it are combined biblical, Jewish, apocryphal, Syriac, patristic, Islamic, etc. strands. Hence, the Kebra Nagast presents a literary reflection of the polychromic pattern of life which is Ethiopia, unquote. This is found at pages 5 to 6. The Kebra Nagast, and in future we'll call it simply the KN, has held a place of honor in Ethiopia for centuries, and Hubbard provides a most telling proof of this when he relates the 1872 account of King John of Ethiopia, who asked Lord Granville of England to return the verifying copy of the KN which was in the British Museum. The basis of the king's request was quite instructive, quote, in my country, my people will not obey my orders without it, unquote. The British obliged in the same year. Even His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie showed regard for the basic stories in the KN. This comes out in the credence he bestows on the KN's account of the descent of Ethiopian kings from Solomon and the Queen of Sheba in the 1955 Ethiopian constitution which he devised. The KN was compiled in the late 13th or early 14th century AD with a threefold motive in mind: patriotic, religious, and political. The scribe Isaac hints at these three motives in the colophon or the explanatory note at the end of the KN. Quote, for I have labored much for the glory of the land of Ethiopia, for the going out of the heavenly Zion, and for the glory of the King of Ethiopia, unquote. As Hubbard says, quote, there is virtually unanimous agreement among scholars as to the political motive. The KN was written to justify the claims of the so-called Solomonic dynasty founded by Yekuna Amlak, approximately 1270 to 1285 AD, over against those of the Zagwe family, who held sway for well over a century. Yekuna Amlak claimed to be the legitimate heir to the throne as a descendant of Solomon, whereas the Zagwe were held to be usurpers, unquote. This is found at page 360 of Hubbard's doctoral dissertation. The KN is dominated by two fundamental themes: the descent of Ethiopian monarchs from Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, and the transfer of the Jewish Ark of the Covenant to Ethiopia. There are many, apart from Ethiopians and Rastas, who believe that the Jewish Ark of the Covenant was really taken to Ethiopia, where it is at present. See, for example, Graham Hancock's book, The Sign and the Seal, a book written in 1992. What has lent some plausibility to theories about the whereabouts of the Ark of the Covenant is the paucity of biblical evidence concerning the history of the Ark after its initial construction at Sinai. See Exodus 25:10 through 22. We now mention a few pertinent facts pertaining to the KN's contention of an abducted ark during Solomon's reign. If the ark was really abducted by the son of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, then the event would have had to take place in the 10th or 9th century BC. According to 1 Kings 8, the ark was placed in the temple during Solomon's reign. The ark was recited in the sanctuary during Josiah's reform, according to 2 Chronicles 35:3. This would have been about the 7th century BC. The ark then disappears from the biblical record and was presumably lost or burnt during the 6th century BC destruction of Jerusalem, including the burning of the temple, by the Babylonians, or it was lost during the exile, since it is not mentioned in Ezra or Nehemiah. According to Josephus, the Jewish historian, there was no ark in the second temple built by Herod. There is a curious mention of an ark, though, in Revelation 11:19, which says, quote, then God's temple in heaven was opened, and within his temple was seen the ark, unquote. Now here is an issue which is important to Rastas, pronouncing the names Jesus and Jah. Rastas resolutely reject the traditional pronunciation of the word Jesus as sounding like Jesus, long E as in C. They prefer the sound Jesus, short E as in met. The pronunciation turns on the movement from Greek to English. The word for Jesus in Greek transliterated into English characters is Iesous, pronounced in Greek as Jesus. When translated into English, this Greek word becomes Jesus, and there are two important things to note. First, the first letter in the Greek word for Jesus is iota, and this is transliterated into English legitimately as either Y or J. The second thing of importance has to do with the second letter in the Greek word for Jesus. That letter is eta, long E in English, and this is translated into English as E with a long sound. You may remember lowercase eta from mathematics, and it will be interesting to call to mind how that was pronounced by your teacher back then. Some call the letter with a pronunciation that directly mimics the Greek, hence technically and correctly, eta, A-Y, as in may, while most others call the letter with the pronunciation eta, a double E as in meat. It is this latter pronunciation of eta that has influenced the traditional pronunciation of Jesus. It should be noted that if a Rasta is being fussy about how one pronounces the word Jesus, the only defensible options from a linguistic standpoint would be the traditional pronunciation or calling the word with the unusual but correct sound Jesus, capturing the technical sound of eta, or that pronunciation which treats the word as it would sound in Greek, Jesus, but most definitely not as most Rastas prefer to say it, Jesus, with the E as in met. A popular word that Rastas use of His Imperial Majesty is Jah, an abbreviation of Yahweh, the Hebrew word for God. But one could quibble about the traditional pronunciation that Rastas use, that with a hard J. The first Hebrew letter of Jah and Yahweh is Yod in Hebrew, and, like the Greek iota, this is transliterated into English legitimately as either Y or J, with the pronunciation options being hard J or Y. One could defensively say Ya Rastafari or Jah Rastafari because both are legitimate linguistic options. In fact, since Yahweh is spelled and pronounced with an initial Y linguistically, Ya is the more correct spelling and the initial Y sound more correct than the initial J sound. Now the issue of whether Jesus was black and dreadlocked. In an article in the Jamaican Record of August 22, 1989, the Rastafarian author and veteran journalist Barbara Blake Hanna wrote, quote, "Christ was written off as a Nazarite whose hair no razor came upon. I often wonder how Western artists can paint Christ as a man with shoulder-length Caucasian hair, if his hair had not been cut for 33 years. And what convinces me Christ was dreadlocked is that I am certain he did not rise up each of the 40 mornings in the wilderness and comb out his hair, which must have been down to his knees by then," unquote. Her brother in the faith, then Dr. Leakim Semaj, had previously asserted something similar without evidence or argumentation. See Jamaica Record, 4th of August, 1989. That Jesus Christ of Nazareth could have been black and dreadlocked can be accepted within the framework of the possible. Likely or certain even, depending on the evidence adduced and the argumentation advanced. Neither Dr. Semaj nor Mrs. Blake Hanna has yet moved the issue out of the realm of the merely possible, which is not the same as saying our Lord was not black and dreadlocked. Mrs. Blake Hanna offers an argument, quoted earlier, which is not bad, but for her basic premise, which is questionable. She states, quote, "Christ was written off as a Nazarite," unquote. But she did not assist us with the reference, which of course need not be biblical. If she was thinking of some biblical reference, then it is one that has slipped my memory and escaped my double-checking. Could Mrs. Blake Hanna have had in mind that it was written of Jesus that he was a Nazarene? That is quite a different idea from being a Nazarite. Even if Mrs. Blake Hanna can convincingly show that our Lord was a Nazarite, then to support or strengthen her case, she would need to prove as well that our Lord's Nazarite vow was a lifelong one. In Numbers 6, 1-21, one finds the fullest treatment of the regulations concerning Nazarites, or Nazirites, the term preferred by scholars. It is clear from this passage that one need not be a Nazirite for life, so the uncut hair is a requirement only for the period of the vow. Mrs. Blake Hannah, it seems, regards His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie as, quote, the returned Messiah, unquote, who, quote, is worthy of his name, his praise, and his worship, unquote, because he has taught that, quote, our task as humans is to recognize his Christ's presence within us and act as Christ's, not handing over our autonomy and holiness to outside sources, but drawing from the indwelling fountain of Godness, unquote. I find that interesting in light of an interview conducted by the same Mrs. Blake Hannah with Abuna Yesak, Ethiopian Orthodox Church Archbishop of the Western Hemisphere, and reported in the Sunday magazine of the Sunday Gleaner of November 25, 1984. In that interview, the Abun indicated that in 1970, he was mandated by Emperor Haile Selassie to establish a branch of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church in Jamaica. Commenting on the proposed mission, the Abun said, quote, I didn't want to go, but the emperor said, I want you to help these people, the Rastafari. My heart is broken because of the situation of these people. Help them find the true God. Teach them. It was the emperor's order, and I could not refuse, unquote. Mrs. Blake Hannah helps us to understand the Abun's reluctance. Quote, he was aware of very negative reports of the Jamaican Rastafari community, some of whom had been requesting to have the church established in Jamaica. What he knew of them was their reputation as crazed fanatics who worship the emperor as God, unquote. For those who are not aware of it, Emperor Haile Selassie had visited Jamaica in 1966 and received a tumultuous welcome from the Rastafari community. The emperor was saddened, though, to learn that Rastafarians regarded him as God. Speaking of the response to what he proclaimed as the church's doctrine, Abuna Yesak says, quote, in the beginning, it was very difficult because while they were glad to see me come from Ethiopia, they did not like the fact that I preached Christ. But I teach them that the emperor is the defender of our faith and the greatest Christian leader of our time. The church cannot baptize in any other name than Christ. But those who want to be baptized in the emperor's name must not be ridiculed or condemned. There must be someone who will be able to contact them and gradually bring them to the truth, unquote. On the issue of Haile Selassie's divinity, the Abun informs, quote, when I am asked, is the emperor God? I say the emperor is a devoted Christian, unquote. The Ethiopian Abun, in the said interview, reveals that he too and his church in Ethiopia believe the report that Haile Selassie died. Archbishop Yesak says, quote, when we were told that the emperor had died, we removed his name from the prayers in our liturgy, and this made a lot of members leave because there was no room for them to pray for the emperor in church. It should say something to Rastafarians that though His Imperial Majesty was much respected in Ethiopia, he never had any group in Ethiopia that worshipped him as God. Further, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, of which the emperor was a member, has no tradition of seeing Haile Selassie as the returned Messiah or God, or as more than a professing Christian who, as Emperor of Ethiopia, was regarded as the defender of the faith, a designation which Queen Elizabeth II in England also has. Historians, sociologists, cultural anthropologists, and some soft-headed Christians are to blame for the now popular but suspect or meaningless notion that Rastafarianism is the most indigenous religious expression that Jamaica has known. This kind of argument is usually advanced with an implied or expressed criticism of Christianity as being an alien religion. Let me indulge an aside. Notice how Rastafarianism and African religious retentions are lauded in academia, yet none of these religious expressions find expression in the lives of many who laud them. A phenomenon similar to that of intellectuals who praise life in communist countries from the security of life in capitalist countries, with not even a hint of desire to take up residence in one of the communist heavens on earth. The all too facile argument for the complementary indigeneity of Rastafarianism and the negative foreignness of Christianity is the result of careless research and faulty reasoning. If by indigenous one means native to, whatever that really means, or homespun, whatever that really means, then the term indigenous need not be complimentary. There are things native to Jamaica and definitely homespun that are not really praiseworthy. So if the term indigenous is not to be taken in a neutral sense, one would have to show why it deserves complimentary connotations. It ought to be said as well that what is not native to or homespun is not necessarily something that is not praiseworthy. Again, arguments would have to be advanced for the rejection. With reference to Rastafarianism as a religion, the dubious best that can be said about it are the words of Dr. Leakim Semaj, that Rastafarianism is, quote, one of the few products of our imagination, creativity, and intellect, unquote. That is true, but it does not constitute a compliment for Rastafarianism. It takes quite a bit of imagination and creativity, and thus intellect, to see Haile Selassie as a black icon and as a god of a better-than-Christian religion. Quite a bit of imagination, I say, because Emperor Haile Selassie was not black and professed to be a Christian, indeed the defender of the Christian faith in Ethiopia. If the argument for Rastafarianism's superior indigeneity has to do with the mere fact of being started here in Jamaica, then other groups share that distinction. What I think has been the line of reasoning is the Garveyan notion of seeing God through Ethiopian eyes. Thus, the argument which preceded Rastafarianism boils down to another, being of Africa, thus more appropriate for us than what is from or in Europe or elsewhere than Africa, kind of argument. There are some hard facts that anti-Christian Garveyites and Rastas need to grapple with. The essence of Garveyism and of Rastafarianism is the notion of the black man's essential worth and dignity, and his equality with members of all other people groups. That, let it not be forgotten, has no more defensible grounding than the Judeo-Christian doctrine of creation by and in the image of God. The essence of Garveyism and Rastafarianism, then, borrows credibility, plausibility, and defensibility from Christianity. Additionally, Rastafarianism as a religion is dependent on a foreign Christian icon, Haile Selassie of Ethiopia. Ethiopia, the landmass par excellence for Rastas, and for Garveys somewhat, has been a Christian empire since the 4th century AD. It is beyond controversy that the more commendable societal cultural values of Ethiopia, prior to Mengistu Haile Mariam, who deposed Haile Selassie, have been shaped by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, one of the oldest Christian churches in the world. If it is hip to copy things that are or were in Africa, why then the seeming aversion to Christianity, when it was in Africa long before it entered or settled in some of the countries with which Christianity is now linked in a derogatory way? By the way, those who are clamoring for repatriation to Ethiopia should realize the implications of that desire. Are they suggesting that any slaves came here via the slave trade from Ethiopia? Then they must face the possibility at least that such slaves were Christians, not animists or polytheists, not cannibals or whatever. It must not be forgotten that Christianity predates Rastafarianism in Jamaica, and that it has been a religion in Africa for close to 2,000 years now. If that which is akin, not alien to us, is that which simply has been with us for a long time, Christianity qualifies. If that which is akin to us is that which simply has roots in Africa, Christianity qualifies again. As I have said elsewhere, if an artifact, a value, a custom, or an outlook is to be retained by a people, such must have some intrinsic worth in addition to being from a particular country. Who would readily extol the virtues of wife-beating, cannibalism, eating maggot-infested meat, trickery and deceit as tribal norms, simply because each had, and some still do have, a place in some African society? The intrinsic value of a set of values or a thing is a more defensible reason for its acceptance than simply its point of origin. In line with the aversion to Christianity that one picks up among some people in society, I mention a forum I planned some years ago, May 4 to 5, 2001, in response to a public lecture done by popular Rasta dub poet Muta Baruka. Muta's lecture was titled, Christianity, 2,000 Years of Illusion on the African Mind. At the forum, a team of Christians, Clinton Chisholm, Billy Hall, and David Pearson, interacted with a team of Rastas, Muta Baruka, Dr. Leakim Semaj, and Aishama Hope, Muta's daughter. What now follows is my initial presentation at that forum. Quote, I closed my introductory statement by asking if Muta really understands the dominant features of the approximately 3,000 traditional religions in pre-Christian Africa. Why am I asking this? Because you would get the mistaken impression from listening to some people in this country and elsewhere that traditional African religions are not only radically dissimilar to Christianity in almost every material particular, but are to be preferred to Christianity. Muta and others like him can learn valuable lessons from internationally recognized African scholars who have researched African traditional religions. The Kenyan John Mbiti is one such scholar, and he happens to be a clergyman. Mbiti's book, African Religions and Philosophy, is a veritable classic and standard reading material in African studies. The book blurb says, Mbiti, quote, deals almost exclusively with traditional concepts and practices in those societies which have not been either Christian or Muslim in any deep way before the colonial period in Africa, unquote. What was and is true of African societies despite their differences and peculiarities? The answer? Religion, a system of beliefs and practices pertaining to a deity, a god. Mbiti says, quote, Africans are notoriously religious, unquote, and, quote, religion permeates into all departments of life so fully that it is not easy or possible always to isolate it, unquote. If you reckon with the realities of traditional African societies and religions, then you realize that Muta's call to return to a philosophy that was ours is a utopian illusion. Listen to Mbiti again, and let all Afrocentrists take careful note. Quote, traditional religions are not universal. They are tribal or national. Each religion is bound and limited to the people among whom it has evolved. Despite spontaneous spreading of ideas through migration, intermarriage and the like, there is no conversion from one traditional religion to another. Each society has its own religious system, and the propagation of such a complete system would involve propagating the entire life of the people concerned. Therefore, a person has to be born in a particular society in order to assimilate the religious system of the society to which he belongs. An outsider cannot enter or appreciate fully the religion of another society. Those few Europeans, and I, Clinton Chisholm, would add Afrocentric Jamaicans, who claim to have converted to African religions, and I know some who make such fantastic claims, do not know what they are saying. To pour libation or observe a few rituals like Africans does not constitute conversion to traditional religions, unquote. It is true that Africans are notoriously religious. Then, to talk about the African mind sensibly and defensibly is to talk about the mind as largely shaped by religions in Africa, especially traditional religions. We must note, therefore, some of the things Mbiti and other scholars say about such traditional religions, which look just like some of the things Muta calls illusion in Christianity, or which shatter some of Muta's beliefs and claims concerning religion. Muta's unproven assertion that, quote, religion is the invention of insecure men to oppress women, unquote, would be totally alien to the intensely religious realities of ancient African societies. But we learn from Mbiti that, quote, over the whole of Africa, creation is the most widely acknowledged work of God, unquote, and that from the Zulu, Akan, Yoruba, Baganda, and others, God is said to be omniscient, all-wise, omnipotent, all-powerful, and omnipresent, simultaneously present everywhere. So God for these traditional African peoples is a supernatural God who is capable of the miraculous. Interestingly, perhaps embarrassingly for Muta, who calls the notion of a seven-day creation a lie, in Yoruba tradition, says the Nigerian Tokunbo Adeyemo, quote, the earth was created in 4 days, the fifth day being designed for rest and worship, unquote. This is found in the book Global God at page 140. So, where were we to heed Muta's call to return to a philosophy that was ours before Christianity came to Africa, we might embrace concepts concerning a supernatural God who created the earth in 4 days, no problem to the African mind. With that African backdrop of God as creator, let me move to a few samples of defective reasoning from Muta. Muta thundered with unjustified certainty, quote, "Is not God make man, is man make God," unquote. For those of you unfamiliar with Jamaican, what he's saying is, it was not God who made man, but man who made God. This is a horrible idea to the African mind, and one which reflects philosophical confusion. Let me warn the average Christian and Rasta that what I'm about to say requires some thought. Muta's blunder is that he does not seem to realize that ideas about an entity are not one and the same as the entity if the entity is not a figment of one's imagination. If the sun is, that is, it has properties or ontological status or participates in being, then my ability or inability to shape ideas or concepts about the sun does not create or negate the reality of the sun. If God is, my human-centered ideas about God could be misleading or even dead wrong, but it does not follow that my concepts have created God and God has not created me. A similar reasoning mistake was made by Muta when he said, quote, "We come to the conclusion that if it wasn't for the Bible, there would be no Christianity," unquote. This is either very silly or very confused. Christianity as a religion or way of life predates the writing of even the earliest documents of the New Testament. The documents bear testimony to the reality of Christianity. They do not create Christianity. Another very serious reasoning blunder came out when Muta was dealing with Christian teaching and the behavior of some Christians. Muta refused to admit the possibility of a distinction to be made between what Christianity or the Bible requires and what Christians in fact do or don't do. Hence, Muta unfairly blamed Christianity for what a Christian might do without showing the logical link between the behavior and Christianity. So he said, moving from blunder to blunder, quote, "If the teaching is different from the practice, therefore the teaching is something that is elusive, that cannot be attained. Therefore, if it cannot be attained, that means it's an illusion." The last part in Jamaican says, that means it is an illusion. A man's reach might exceed his grasp. What you desire to do, you may not in fact do, but it does not follow that what you are aiming for cannot be attained. It doesn't follow at all, logically. But as God would have it, during the question and answer time at Muta's lecture, the first questioner, a professing Rasta, and other Rastas, provided evidence of a distinction between Rastafari belief and the behavior of a Rasta or some Rastas. One questioner mentioned the incident in St. Lucia, which alleges, according to the questioner, that Rastas went into a church and, quote, "burned fire upon Christian and killed 2 of them," unquote, which means set the church ablaze, killing 2 Christians in the blaze. Then the questioner asked quite insightfully if that St. Lucian Ras would be abandoned because of what he did, while acting out Rasta symbolism. The questioner, after spending a while at the mic, attracted flack from other Rastas, but refused to yield the mic, and the incident was a bit awkward. I was right beside the questioner waiting my turn, and eventually Muta left the platform, headed for the questioner, which made me a bit nervous at what might transpire. But Muta took the mic from before the questioner, positioned it before me, and returned to the platform. Very interestingly, after the settling of the air, my friend Ibo Cooper, another Rastafari, the moderator, said of the St. Lucia incident, quote, "Rasta people do not go and bomb or burn down churches. If they did something criminal, we can't support that, brethren," unquote. The last part in Jamaican, "we can't support that, brethren," means we cannot support that kind of behavior, brothers. So, according to Ibo, the behavior of a Rasta might not be in line with how Rasta ought to behave, the very point Muta refused to accept concerning Christians. Further, quite unfairly and unwisely, Muta even blamed Christianity for what is done by even a person living in a country where Christianity is the dominant religion, without showing any logical connection between what Christianity teaches and what people in general choose to do. So we get the outrageous idea, totally lacking in supporting evidence, that, quote, "it is proven, and this is a fact, the countries that practice Christianity is the most decadent societies in the world," unquote. I challenged it at the lecture, and I add to the challenge now by asking, what is the logical link between Christianity's teachings and the decadence that one sees in any society? Is the global pandemic of sexually transmissible infections the result of Christianity's teaching on the need for sexual purity before marriage and fidelity after marriage? Is the rampancy of stealing and corruption in Jamaica and elsewhere the result of Christianity's teaching that stealing and dishonesty are always wrong? Is the prevalence of lying the result of Christianity's teaching on the need to speak the truth always? Let's be fair and sensible and quit the anti-Christian rubbish. As I asked then, so I ask now. Which wholesome or societally useful institution or societal practice has not been given to the society by the church? Do we understand the contribution of the Judeo-Christian faith to the notion of the equality of human beings or to the development of experimental science? The last reasoning blunder I wish to deal with pertains to notions of faith, belief, and knowledge. Both Semaj and Muta blundered here because of conceptual confusion and exaggeration. Semaj tried to show the difference between belief and knowledge, but chose poor examples. So for him, belief implies, quote, a certain amount of doubt, unquote. This could be, but is not always true, because I believe in some sentences could be equal to I know, or I have given it thought and now hold as true that, owing to the content of the belief and the strength of the belief based on the evidence in support of the belief. For example, quote, I believe that the metal chair will support my weight, unquote. Semaj needs to realize that I believe say in Jamaican may not always be the same in meaning as the English I believe that, but could be just as certain. Example, me personal belief say this iron chair here can hold me and you easy, unquote. That in standard English is, I believe that this iron chair right here is able to support your weight and mine quite easily. Additionally, when a person declares that he knows, there is no necessary guarantee of certainty. The person could be mistaken. With reference to Muta, he needs to understand that some Christians see faith as conviction based on evidence or reason. I and numerous Christians believe in the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ because of the evidence supporting that doctrine. So it is not true to say that Christianity is based on faith, nothing else. I move now to some factual historical blunders. Muta is in the dubious company of people like Bishop John Shelby Spong, John Draper, and Andrew White in contending that the Christians and the Hebrews believed in a flat earth. This is an illusion which has been thoroughly debunked by the 1991 book Inventing the Flat Earth by historian Jeffrey Russell, and which runs counter to a clear passage in the Bible, Isaiah 40 and verse 22, which says, quote, He sits enthroned above the circle of the earth, unquote. Another factual blunder from Muta was the claim that, quote, the church has separated man's spirit from man's flesh, and say the flesh is just a house, and when the house burned down, the house still did it, is lie, unquote. The last part in Jamaican says, and when the house is destroyed, the house is still there. That's a lie. The view that the body or flesh is just a trapping or house for the soul is not a Christian but a Greek view, which was explicitly countered by Paul in 1 Corinthians 6 and 7. What was the issue in the Greek intellectual city of Corinth? A dominant Greek view of the body in the first century in Corinth was that flesh, sarx in Greek, was either unreal or, if real, unimportant, since it was just a case for the soul. Since the flesh was unimportant, two conclusions resulted. One, you could do as you like with the body sexually, leading to sexual immorality in the church in Corinth. Or two, you could deny the body of its sexual desires, even as a married person. Both erroneous views are corrected by Paul. In 1 Corinthians 6, 18-20, he rebukes the practice of sexual immorality and counsels that the body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. So the Christian should honor God with the body. With reference to married people who were avoiding sex for super spiritual reasons, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7, quote, the husband should satisfy his wife sexually, and likewise the wife should satisfy her husband sexually, unquote. This is by no means a separation of spirit or soul from body. We should note as well that the Christian doctrine of resurrection is intensely bodily, physical. Unlike the Greek concept of a disembodied spirit, in the afterlife. We need to read the Bible again before we comment or criticize. To say that the Hebrews had no religion, no system of beliefs and practices pertaining to a deity is somewhat pardonable on the lips of an atheist, but a major indictable blunder for a Rasta. The books of Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and others in the Old Testament are just oozing with material pertaining to religious beliefs and ritual practices. Paul in Galatians 1:13 speaks of his way of life in the Jewish religion, and in Acts 26:5, addressing Agrippa, he speaks of the Pharisees as the strictest sect of the Jewish religion. It is being factually wrong and linguistically careless to say that scientific instruments prove that the earth is not 6,000 years old. Let it be known that it was not the Bible, but Bishop Ussher who argued for a 6,000-year-old earth. It also should be known that there are solid scientific reasons why the earth could possibly be less than 10,000 years old and not the 4 to 6 billion years that we often read about. I mention a few such young earth indicators. 1. Atomic clocks measuring the earth's spin rate indicates a slowing down at the rate of almost 1 second a year. Extrapolating backwards for billions of years would indicate a fantastically rapid rate, which would have led to major distortions in the shape of the earth. 2. The quantity of helium in the atmosphere is less than 40,000 years worth, and there is no known means of large-scale helium loss from the atmosphere. 3. Oil and gas pressures in rocks suggest a young earth. Those who would criticize Christianity must do their homework if they hope to be taken seriously by thinking people. Those who would continue with the Rastafari movement as serious adherents must deal with the revelations on Rastafari on this CD, which will be in print form soon. Interested persons may contact me, Clinton Chisholm, at 954-963-0634. That's in Florida. Or by email at clintchis, that's CLINTCHIS, @yahoo.com.